Hello, I'm John Molesky. Welcome to Wilson Center Now, a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. My guest today is Bruce Jentleson. Bruce is a Wilson Center Distinguished Fellow and the William Preston Few Distinguished Professor of Public Policy and Professor of Political Science at Duke University, also the author of this new book, Sanctions, What Everyone Needs to Know. Bruce, great to see you again. Welcome back.
Well, thanks. Thank you for having me back, and it's great to be here at the center. This is where I finished the book last spring as a Distinguished Fellow, so it's great to be here.
Outstanding, outstanding. So, at the time you were finishing the book, Russia invades Ukraine. Suddenly you have this major case study of sanctions. And in the book you say, by many measures, the most extensive sanctions ever imposed. And now there's some breathing room between when you wrote that and where we are today. Let's start with that case study, and then we'll backtrack to some of the things that you cover in the book. Sure. How have sanctions against Russia in the case of Ukraine played out?
Well, it's interesting. I will say, that way back when I was a doctoral student, I wrote my PhD dissertation at Cornell in the early 80s. I wrote it on two Soviet-era energy pipelines to Europe. One was called the Friendship Oil Pipeline in the 1960s, and then the Siberian natural gas pipeline in the early 80s. So with Nord Stream, I feel like I got a trilogy now of pipelines, right?
Yeah.
So what makes these so extensive, other than those imposed by UN Security Council resolution, which basically require all countries in the world to cooperate, even though they don't always get enforced, was two things. The number of countries that have supported them, not everybody. China and India have some trade with Russia, although not as much as people might have feared. Brazil, Israel, others did. But the number of countries that cooperated with these, and then the number of aspects of the economy that it covered, finance, technology like semiconductors, a whole variety of other exports. And then the kind of sanctions that really people pay attention to, sports, banned from the World Cup, banned from Formula One, banned from international weightlifting, which is a big sport in the Soviet Union, which is also what happened, by the way, in South Africa in the 80s, was not only the economics, but was when South Africa got banned from World Rugby and things that really affected the average person. So the amount of the economy that has been covered, as well as the number of countries doing the sanctions, have made them the most extensive we've seen outside of UN Security Council ones.
And this might be a good opportunity to segue into a discussion of types of sanctions that you cover in the book. And by the way, I was telling you before we began recording, I'll tell you now in front of our viewers, book is fantastic and a terrific primer on sanctions. You're humble in your conclusion where you say, of course, it's not everything you need to know because it's complex, but it's pretty comprehensive, Bruce. I will tell you that. So let's start. What are the types of sanctions? I think we tend to think of them in terms of nation to nation, but it could be an individual, it could be an organization. What are the various types?
Yeah, it's when I started this book in 2020, I was, people say the United States have made sanctions the Swiss Army knife of American foreign policy. We way overuse them. And as you know, there's a chapter in how China is actually using sanctions, not just targeted by them. And so you get lots of different sanctions even before the Russia-Ukraine case happened. So you have embargoes, which are efforts to ban trade in a variety of goods. And sometimes it focus on particular areas of trade, and sometimes they can be across-the-board embargoes, right? So way back in 1973, OPEC embargoed oil to the United States and to parts of Europe. You have boycotts where you're actually refusing to buy the target's own exports and your imports, right? For countries that receive foreign aid, a lot of times foreign aid is used as a sanction. Finance, the power of the dollar, the centrality of the dollar, particularly in the last 10 or 15 years, has been in fact, sanctions have been moved actually more to the Treasury Department than even the State Department because of finance. And then you have these what are called individually targeted sanctions. In the jargon, there's something in Treasury called the SDN, the Specially Designated Nationals. Lists of individuals. In the Russia case, it's certain oligarchs, it's Putin and his family, you get drug lords, you get terrorists. But that list, as of the spring, had about 15,000 individuals and organizations on it. The EU has a similar list. So sometimes you're going after the individuals, thinking let's try to hit them and not hit the whole population. Some are on investment, banning investment into countries. And some are things like sports and culture and travel, right? And again, those have an impact because they hit the average person in a ways that the economic sanctions sometimes are cushioned by the target government. So a whole variety of them. And we've basically drawn on all of those in the Russia-Ukraine case.
There's a temptation for an interviewer, a generalist like me, to go to the bottom line, do sanctions work, right? But you make the case in the book that it's too complex to answer that question definitively. But you do cite some studies that say 22% success rate, 34% success rate, and you quote one that says little independent influence as achieved through sanctions. So when you look at the totality of the types of sanctions, the situations that you've charted in the book, can you make a general statement about effectiveness?
So you can point to two things. One is how do we measure effectiveness? And the other is what are the key factors? So on the first point, one of the key issues is that economic impact often happens with sanctions, but it doesn't necessarily lead to policy change. I mean, look at Cuba for 60 plus years, right? A lot of economic impact, regime's still there. Look at North Korea, US, UN sanctions for over 30 years, building more nuclear weapons. And so there's a tendency to think, in some ways it's like our own military power, like when we went into Iraq and Afghanistan, oh, we've got a lot of military power. Guess what? It didn't succeed. And so it's not just a case, how do you convert that economic impact into policy change? The other part of it, I think, is there's a real ethical issue there, which was really interesting for democracy and human rights sanctions, right? So a lot of times we'll impose sanctions to stand up for democracy, human rights, to let the world know that we have, principles and soft power and that sort of thing. A lot of times those sanctions, though, end up hurting the people you're trying to help, and the regime insulates itself. And so while you say you're doing the right thing, there's a fundamental ethical issue there about what your intentions are and what the consequences are that we really need to think through sometimes when we think about, oh yeah, Myanmar is a good example. Of course that coup in 2021 was a terrible thing by the military. They're very repressive, throwing people in jail, killing people. But the sanctions have actually hurt the people more than the regime. And so before you put on the sanctions, you have to think about it. In terms of how to make them work, there are a couple things that the success cases point to, right? So one is what you were saying before, broad multilateral support, because one of the strategies that a target has is turn to alternative trade partners. And you can't always eliminate them, but the more multilateral support you have, the better. Second one is to understand that sanctions are kind of limited impact, right? Nobody ever says uncle. No matter what the economic impact, Putin's not going to say uncle to the sanctions, right? The South Africans didn't say uncle. They negotiated a change from apartheid.
Is there a single historical example where someone has said uncle?
No. There never is. There have been most of them are where you get a limited policy change, right? For example, in 2003, we and the British used sanctions and the lifting of the sanctions with Gaddafi in Libya to get him to end his WMD, weapons of mass destruction programs. He didn't have a bomb yet, but he had them, and to make a settlement on that old Pan Am 103 terrorism case. And so it was a limited objective, and sanctions worked for that. And it didn't totally change Gaddafi, but 2010, 2011, when the Arab Spring and then the chaos rolls around, it's pretty good that he didn't have nuclear weapons, right? Iran under Obama, we had sanctions to get them to agree to nuclear nonproliferation. We weren't trying to change the regime. We weren't trying to change everything that we didn't like that Iran did. Limited instrument for a limited objective. Trump, for example, ratcheted up the sanctions on Iran and had even more economic impact, but was pursuing regime change. That's a big objective. It's not going to happen. So you get this proportionality between the sanctions and your objective. And then the other thing is ultimately you have to have a little bit of reciprocity. You have to have, in Libya, it was okay, you do these things, we'll lift some sanctions. With Iran, you do these things, we'll lift some. We will probably get to a point, or we may get to a point in Ukraine where we will have to think about, what would we do if Russia agrees to withdraw and end the war and the like. They're not going to say, the pain hurts, we're going home.
What you're describing is that you create a bargaining chip for yourself.
Create a bargaining chip, exactly right.
So on this, a couple things. So let me start with the whole ethics of sanctions. In a nuclear world, it's a much easier to levy economic sanctions than to risk a military confrontation that could escalate. But one of the ethics or morals or even international law around warfare is you don't target civilians. But it seems that sanctions, by their nature, end up targeting civilians. Is this discussed among the policymakers? Is this an ongoing debate that sanctions are essentially the economic equivalent of targeting civilians?
It's a really good point. Part of what happened, so in the times I've been in government, I was in the State Department 2009, 2011, worked some on the Iran sanctions. Way back in 93, 94, in the Clinton-Gore administration, I was there when we were doing the China Tiananmen Square sanctions. So I've kind of seen it from the inside. There is a tendency to say, when in doubt, do sanctions. Well, hey, we don't want to attack. And what happens, think about anybody in any situation, if you choose a policy option or a business strategy on the basis of the negatives of the others, you haven't really looked at the negatives of your strategy. It doesn't mean you need something perfect, but I know from my own experience and from other people in government that it's just turned too quickly. It like cuts off debate, let's do sanctions, even though they can have these effects. And then you really have to think about it. I mean, I think in the case of the Russia sanctions, the ethical question seems to be less pressing. The ethical question actually is the sanctions and a bunch of other things are having effects in the rest of the world on food supply. But I would say that's more about the Russian war than about the sanctions, right?
Right.
Because the Russians are the ones who were not allowing the grain to leave Ukraine, and the like.
But winter is coming, and gas and oil
That's right.
in Europe and elsewhere.
Right. So in Afghanistan, right, when the Taliban came to power, and they were headed into this past winter, with a lot of starvation and freezing, there was a debate, and a lot of the NGOs were saying it's unethical to not lift some of the sanctions, and other people were saying you're going to teach the Taliban the wrong lesson. David Miliband, who's one of the major former foreign minister of Britain, one of the major NGOs, was really strongly saying we need to help the people, right? And then what happens also is what the business community calls de-risking, right? So this happened a lot in Syria, especially in the Trump years, where they were like going after companies. And for shipping companies, for suppliers, and for insurance companies, they were trying to provide aid to the NGOs working in northern Syria, helping people. They were concerned that they might inadvertently violate the Trump rules on sanctions and be liable for fines and lawsuits, right? So they would do what they call de-risk. Sorry, we can't help the NGO because it could get us in trouble, right? So there are a lot of ethical questions. I think often that, frankly, I think often we say, well, we're doing the right thing and that's the most ethical aspect of it. And I think that gets in the way. Some of this, you can do, you don't have to wait for it to happen. Part of the argument I'm making in the book is you need to do a net assessment as much as you can from the beginning. Mm-hmm. What are the benefits? What are the likely costs? And if we know those and we still do sanctions, we're more likely to have lower costs and more benefits.
So sanctions are imposed. Economic pain is felt by the target of the sanctions. Is there a sweet spot as far as timing where you can then essentially use that as a bargaining chip and make a deal? Because if the sanctions just become chronic, Cuba, the country learns to live with them,
right,
and they now become almost more symbolic than effective in changing policy.
Right, and they become a target. You blame everything on the sanctions, right, even though you're doing things. So I'll give you two examples. One is Cuba. So we've had sanctions. The Obama administration tried to normalize relations. Trump pushed it back. Biden has been very cautious on this. And we want full change, Spain, the former colonial power, and the European Union has had some sanctions, but more limited sanctions. And a few years ago, through the Catholic Church in Spain, with the Catholic Church in Cuba, negotiated the release of, I think it was about 20 political prisoners in exchange for some limited lifting of sanctions. So they didn't do the all or nothing, and they got more than we've gotten for 60 years of the all or nothing, right? So there you had a situation in which your sanctions helped you get some, achievement there. In other situations, South Africa is a really good example. If you had sat down in late 1970s and sanctions against South Africa started globally under the UN in the 60s, early 80s, and said, are sanctions successful? You'd say no, right? In 1986, a couple things happened. One was, for the first time, the U.S. really joined the sanctions. Very interesting, John, in our current politics. The Anti-Apartheid Act, which was passed in Congress, was vetoed by President Reagan because there is still this sense that the African National Conference was Marxist or whatever. And the veto was overridden by a Republican Senate, and House. People like Senator Richard Lugar at the time, Congressman Hamilton, a former director,
it was a different world.
It's a different world. And at the same time, some banks decided not to roll over South African loans because it was a bad economic. All of those came together with the negotiations with Mandela. So by the end, that became one of the iconic cases. So it's hard to know what the sweet spot is. The sweet spot really is where you feel that you've connected the sanctions to kind of power brokers in the country, including in non-democracies. This is what happened in Libya, that can throw some weight around to try to bring about, a change, even in a leader that's resistant. That's not been possible in North Korea.
Is it possible in Russia? Is it the oligarchs? Who are those people?
So I don't think it's so much the oligarchs. They're really the Yeltsin era oligarchs, and they don't have much weight in the Putin circles. I actually think if you follow the press lately, we're getting two kind of reports. The New York Times is a good example. One day it said, nothing's changed in Russia. People don't care. They're supporting the regime. And the next day you get a report about all of these movements that are starting. And now with this new call up of reserves, I mean, there's a lot. And so there are elements there. And so one doesn't have to think about a new Gorbachev, but one can think about, out of the so-called Siloviki, the national security military, a Russian nationalist who basically says, I don't like NATO. I didn't like the idea that Ukraine might join us someday, but I'm watching what's happening to my military, and I'm watching what's happening to my pride. And I actually think it's in my Russian nationalist interest to start to see if there's a deal that can be made. This is not working for us.
Yeah.
I would not, I'm not betting my next mortgage payment on it, but I think we're too ready to say that can't happen in a dictatorship. When it happens, we say, oh, wow, I guess it could happen. So we got to pay, we can't put too much weight on it, but we can't dismiss it. And I think there's some, there's a push on the right wing from Putin too to do even more. But yes, I think it's possible in Russia. And then we need to be prepared for what would be, it'd be great if there's some quiet diplomacy going on. In the Cuban Missile Crisis, that was what got it out of it, was some very quiet diplomacy that worked the issues until they got, to more formal stuff. Mm-hmm. So I would pay attention to that and see what happens.
So one thing that was really surprising to me, which I don't know if it says something about sanctions or something about my ignorance about sanctions and the history, this dates back to Athenians leveling sanctions against Sparta in 432 BC. Yeah. Stunning.
Yeah, well, it was the same kind of thing. It was an effort to, stop a war and punish an ally of Sparta on Athens' border. And then Napoleon used them during his, and they were counterproductive to Napoleon, right? They ended up hurting his own economy, and they, as well as his offensive into Russia, led to his downfall. So one study that was done actually by the Peterson Institute of International Economics, I think the number was between 1915 and 1940, or maybe 10 or 15 sanctions cases. But from 1945 on, we've had many, many more, right? The UN from 1945 to 65 imposed sanctions 4 times. Since 1965, it's been over 40. Yeah. And then you get into countries like China, which had always been a target for sanctions, now using them quite a bit themselves.
What that UN change? What happened? What's that demarcation line from 4 to 40?
The two main driving issues was Rhodesia back in 1965, which were really the first comprehensive sanctions, and South Africa. And then the sense, actually a lot was happening in the 90s where we were all turning to the UN a bit, the 80s and the 90s to play a larger role. The UN sanctions were crucial after the Gulf War in 1991 in Iraq. And there were some downsides to them about hurting the people because of the way they were done and the way Saddam corrupted them. But it both got the UN inspectors in and imposed on Iraq. A lot of the African conflicts, the Central African Republic, Cote d'Ivoire, Liberia, sanctions have been combined with negotiating strategies to try to bring these armed conflicts down. So, they've been a useful tool for the UN. But I will say that even with UN sanctions busting can happen, right? And, some of it is governments looking the other way, and some of it is very creative, like right now what's happening with Russia is there's so-called, ships in the sea, dark oil being transferred from one ship to the other. So enforcing sanctions can be pretty tough.
Yeah, it's a heavy lift. I want to ask you about the U.S. As the world leader in sanctions, and make a potential connection to China and their changing view of sanctions. Is it what it appears to be? The U.S. uses them a lot because it's been the top economy in the world for decades, and so you play the cards you have?
Yep. Yeah. I mean, I think we see ourselves having a lot of economic power. And as a global power, we have lots of concerns around the world, so it becomes an instrument, again, overused. Somebody pointed out to me, well, Swiss Army knife, every part of the Swiss Army knife is useful, and you're saying, but what I really meant is you use it for a lot of things. And China's now in the same position, right?
Yeah, your opening line about China in the chapter on China, China's views on economic sanctions sure have changed. So is it because they're feeling their oats as an economic power?
Yeah, they like to say it's Western imperialism, capitalism. They still say that when we impose sanctions against them on the Uyghurs and a variety of other things. But they have imposed sanctions in a number of aspects. A couple examples. They imposed them against South Korea in 2016-17 when they deployed the THAAD anti-missile system. which was supposed to be to protect them against North Korea, and China was concerned that that could be part of a missile defense for U.S. allies in the region that could hurt China. And South Korea did not, take out the THAAD system. They came to a compromise, which was they would not build another one, which they didn't have plans for anyway. South Africa imposed them against Australia. When the Australians had found lots of Chinese, kind of like the Russian intervention in our elections, Chinese money flowing into Australian elections, and then the former Prime Minister of Australia, Scott Morrison, called for a WHO investigation of COVID. So China posed, and Australia gets a lot of its trade there. Well, Australia found alternative partners and controlled the economic impacts, and now both countries are trying to figure out where, how to kind of work their way out of this dilemma. The interesting sanctions that China has are not so much those they imposed formally against the government, are those that I call informal cued sanctions. The word goes out on social media to the wolf warriors. So with South Korea, there's a chain of South Korean department stores, Lati, all over China. Well, suddenly they were all in violation of fire codes, and they had to be closed down. It wasn't sanctions, but it's just fire codes, right? The NBA,
Right.
the NBA over Hong Kong, a general manager sent out a tweet with some sympathy in 2019 for the Hong Kong protesters. And China is a big part of the NBA income and market. And so China took the NBA off television, off, internet and stuff. And there's a couple of missteps originally by the NBA, but basically they have worked it out over the years. So this way of cueing sanctions to consumers, we kind of do it in our country when you get like boycotts of rainforest timber against Home Depot and stuff, but that usually comes from civil society, not from the government. So it's been using sanctions quite a bit, as well as being targeted from, and that is very much a sense of its own economic power that it's had in the last 10, 15 years.
Give us a peek behind the curtain for the author's brain. So when you start this project, you have certain assumptions, certain knowledge that you bring to the table. And then in the course of researching the book and writing the book, did anything change in your view of sanctions significantly from when you began to where we are today?
I can't say no. That would sound rather pompous and arrogant. It's not true. I think I got a clearer sense of this question of what are the 4 or 5 factors to take into account to make sanctions successful. And it is the multilateral support, the proportionality, the reciprocity, the enforcement, and then this notion. What I was saying before about power brokers. I use the metaphor in the book of power brokers of either being transmission belts or circuit breakers, right? If their interests are not in changing the policy and are with the regime because they have shared interest or fear, they're circuit breakers. They stop the impact from coming in. If they begin to see their interest shifting, which is what happened in Libya from the late 90s to the early 2000s, around Gaddafi, had to do with their oil industry, a variety of other things, they can kind of become transmission belts. So you have to find the right way to tap the domestic politics, whether it's a democracy or a non-democracy. And if you're thinking about sanctions and you use that as a template and you're sitting in the State Department or the NSC, and it's not a bad template to use, and then do your net assessment of the costs and benefits. So I felt like I got a better sense that doesn't point to, one magic factor, but you can really, I think, apply in policy to make them more effective and know when they can be counterproductive.
One final thought, Bruce, looking ahead, as you look at the landscape and the global economy, and you see a player like China on the rise, and you see challenges to the supremacy of the US dollar or other, or trade pacts or whatever it might be, are sanctions a growth industry, or will they begin to become less effective because of the nature of the global economy?
Really good question. So in spring 2021, the Biden administration did a sanctions review. This was before Russia-Ukraine, and if you go back to that, it was led by Treasury. There was a sense of let's use them less, let's use them more effectively, let's pay attention to where we impose sanctions and our exports get hurt, but others don't cooperate, take all that into account. So I think there's a sense of the ways they can be counterproductive. Now, if in the Russia case it comes out that if the Ukrainian military hadn't been so courageous and effective, and NATO hadn't provided so much support, sanctions wouldn't matter to hill of beans, right? But if the combination of the military strategy and the sanctions do end up bringing this war to an acceptable resolution for the Ukrainians and for the West, people might say, sanctions really work. So they might say, what about if China invades Taiwan, right? And I think there's some factors about the Ukraine case that are not replicable there, right? Ukraine was one country invading another, just like when Saddam invaded Kuwait, we got lots of international support. We didn't in 2003. We can debate Taiwan, but it is not an interstate conflict, right? And so that legitimacy in the international system wouldn't be there as much. And Ukraine being in the center of Europe, memories that it hooked up. And I don't think if China did anything in Taiwan, it would be, I think it's learned from Putin. I'm not sure it's going to do it anyway. And the other thing is international business, right? A lot of international business pulled out of Russia. But its economic interests in China are significant, even with a little bit of decoupling and diversifying investments and stuff. So to me, the lesson would be, and we're actually having some meetings the next couple of days to talk about this, is there were very unique circumstances in Russia, Ukraine. Sanctions may not work, but if they do, it will be because of a set of unique circumstances. And if you can't replicate those, don't assume because they worked in Russia, Ukraine, they're going to work in your next case.
Well, Bruce, thank you. Terrific as always. Always a pleasure. Congratulations on the book, and best of luck.
Great, thank you. Appreciate it.
Always.
Great, thanks.
The book is Sanctions, What Everyone Needs to Know. The author is Bruce Jentleson. And I should tell you that if you come to the Wilson Center website, Bruce is going to be doing a book event with the Wilson Center, so you'll have another chance to hear from the author with some different people asking questions, so you might cover some different ground. We hope you enjoyed this edition of Wilson Center Now and that you'll join us again soon. Until then, for all of us at the Center, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for your time and interest.